Abundance is a nonfiction book that articulates a bold vision for reimagining American liberalism to address the crises of the 21st century. Ezra Klein, a New York Times columnist, and Thompson, a staff writer at The Atlantic, argue that the United States faces a pervasive crisis of scarcity, housing shortages, insufficient clean energy, labor deficits, and stalled technological progress, rooted in decades of policies that prioritize process over outcomes. The book, described as a once-in-a-generation, paradigm-shifting call to renew a politics of plenty, proposes an abundance agenda to overcome these barriers by building more, innovating faster, and rethinking liberal governance. The authors dedicate the book to a simple yet transformative idea. To have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. That's it. That's the thesis. They envision a future where clean, abundant energy flows from nuclear plants and rooftop solar panels. Medical advancements have made life better and longer. And artificial intelligence has come not to doom us, but to save us from the drudgeries of work. This techno-optimistic vision, reminiscent of the 1964 New York World's Fair Futurama exhibit with its dreams of lunar flights and oceanic hotels, contrasts sharply with the current reality of unaffordability and shortage. The authors assert that to trace the history of the 21st century so far is to trace a history of unaffordability and shortage. Klein and Thompson identify specific crises. After years of refusing to build sufficient housing, America has a national housing crisis. After years of limiting immigration, we don't have enough workers. After decades of offshoring manufacturing, we have a shortage of chips for cars and computers. Despite decades of being warned about the consequences of climate change, we haven't built anything close to the clean energy infrastructure we need. These problems, they argue, stem not from external villains, but from systemic failures. The crisis that's clicking into focus now has been building for decades because we haven't been building enough. The authors trace the origins of today's scarcity to the 1970s, when progressive reforms, while well-intentioned, created unintended barriers to progress. They write, over the course of the 20th century, America developed a right that fought the government and a left that hobbled it. The 1970s saw landmark legislation like the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, designed to curb environmental damage from post-war industrial growth. However, these laws, along with procedural requirements for environmental reviews, zoning regulations, and anti-corruption standards, have become so complex and burdensome that they're now dysfunctional. For example, environmental laws meant to protect against harmful projects now block solar farms and transmission lines critical for clean energy. Klein and Thompson note rules and regulations designed to solve the environmental problems of the 1970s often prevent urban density and green energy projects that would help solve the environmental problems of the 2020s. Similarly, zoning laws and local veto powers protect existing homeowners but exacerbate housing shortages. In 2023, Metro Houston issued 70,000 housing permits compared to just 40,000 in Metro New York, despite New York's larger population, illustrating the impact of restrictive policies. The authors argue that Democrats since the 1970s have prioritized obstructing harmful economic development over promoting the beneficial kind, focusing on process rather than results. They describe a vetocracy, a term borrowed from political scientist Francis Fukuyama, where multiple stakeholders, homeowners, environmentalists, unions can halt projects leading to stagnation. This regulatory sclerosis, they contend, has turned progressive ideals into barriers. Each individual decision is rational, but collectively they create a system so consumed trying to balance its manifold interests that it can no longer perceive what is in the public's interest. Klein and Thompson propose an abundance agenda to address these challenges through regulatory reform and public investment. Their agenda focuses on 5 key areas: housing, green energy, transportation, technological innovation, and healthcare. They advocate for policies that increase supply to meet demand, arguing that demand-side subsidies quickly lose their power if you do not ensure an adequate supply of the goods and services you want people to access. Housing. The authors call for building more housing to address the national crisis. They criticize zoning laws and environmental reviews that empower homeowners to block new construction, noting that building codes and zoning regulations are designed to protect the value of existing homes, making it difficult to build new ones or to increase housing density. They support YMBY movements to streamline permitting and reduce veto points. Green energy. Klein and Thompson advocate for expanding nuclear power and solar energy, criticizing regulations that hinder clean energy projects. They note that infrastructure projects face more than 60 separate review processes from federal authorities alone, delaying critical climate solutions. They propose simplifying these processes to accelerate green energy development. Transportation. The authors highlight failures like California's high-speed rail, which remains incomplete despite decades of planning. They argue for reforming contracting requirements and environmental reviews to enable efficient infrastructure projects. Technological innovation. Klein and Thompson critique the risk-averse nature of scientific funding, particularly at the National Institutes of Health, which favors established researchers over bold ideas. They write, "The innovation system in the United States is broken in a number of ways, including too much risk aversion in science financing, high administrative burdens on scientific research, and too little support for converting scientific discoveries into efficient mass production." They propose increased funding for high-risk, high-reward research and support for scaling innovations. Healthcare. The authors address rising healthcare costs and access issues, arguing that regulatory burdens and a focus on process over outcomes limit progress. They suggest reforms to make healthcare more affordable and accessible, though specific proposals are less detailed. A central argument is that liberals have inadvertently undermined their own goals. Klein and Thompson write, "Liberals spend decades working at every level of government and society to make it hard to build recklessly. They got used to crafting coalitions and legislation that gave everyone a bit of what they wanted, even if it meant the final product was astonishingly expensive, or slow to construct, or perhaps never found its way to completion at all. This everything bagel problem, where policies are weighed down by competing priorities, results in inefficiency." The authors also critique the progressive tendency to prioritize protections over progress. They argue, for decades, American liberalism has measured its success in how close it could come to the social welfare system of Denmark, but this focus has been undermined by failures to build enough housing or infrastructure. They call for a liberalism that builds, one that balances regulation with action. If liberals do not want Americans to turn to the false promise of strongmen, they need to offer the fruits of effective government. Klein and Thompson identify political and cultural barriers to abundance. Politically, they note resistance from entrenched constituencies within the Democratic coalition, such as unions supporting wage requirements or environmentalists opposing regulatory reform. They acknowledge that the administrative bottlenecks to abundance represent distinct interests, complicating reform efforts. Culturally, they critique a progressive distrust of technology, which intensified after the 2016 election when social media and tech billionaires were blamed for Trump's victory. Klein reflects, progressivism had developed a dysfunctional relationship with technology. The leaders of social media platforms represented tech, and they were these mega and quite unaccountable billionaires. This skepticism, they argue, hinders innovation in areas like AI and drug development. The authors acknowledge trade-offs in their agenda, but are criticized for not fully addressing them. They write, "We imagine a future not of less, but of more. We do not subscribe to the seductive ideologies of scarcity. We will not get more or better jobs by closing our gates to immigrants. We will not turn back climate change by persuading the world to starve itself of growth. However, critics argue that they elide the genuine trade-offs between their vision and progressive ideology, particularly regarding environmental protections. For instance, loosening environmental reviews could risk ecological harm, a concern the authors address cautiously. They also face criticism for their emphasis on strong leadership over countervailing powers like legislatures or community groups, which some see as flirting with technocratic overreach. The authors counter that progress requires facing up to the institutions in life that are not working as they need to, urging liberals to recognize government failures and conservatives to see when government is needed. Abundance is part of a broader abundance movement that includes YMBY advocates, pro-innovation think tanks, and commentators. The book builds on Thompson's 2022 Atlantic essay, A Simple Plan to Solve All of America's Problems, and Klein's 2021 New York Times op-ed, The Economic Mistake the Left is Finally Confronting. The authors aim to remake the Democratic Party, stating, in the conclusion of the book, they make it very clear that they want abundance to be part of a vanguardist movement that remakes the Democratic Party and then the political order. They argue that this movement counters the scarcity agenda of figures like Donald Trump, who promote economic hardship and exclusion. Klein and Thompson assert, at a time when movements of scarcity are gaining power in country after country, this is an answer that meets the challenges of the moment while grappling honestly with the fury so many rightfully feel. The book has been praised as powerful and persuasive by Fareed Zakaria and spectacular by David Brooks, who notes that it offers a comprehensive indictment of the current problems and a clear path forward. Klein and Thompson usher in a mood shift. They inspire hope and enlarge the imagination. However, critics like Matt Bruenig argue that its focus on growth must be paired with egalitarian concerns, warning that the broader abundance movement could align with libertarian or tech sector interests. Others, like Hannah Story Brown, contend that the authors ignore who profits from scarcity, such as wealthy interests manipulating regulations. Abundance is a clarion call for a liberalism that builds, urging progressives to overcome self-imposed barriers and embrace a politics of plenty. Klein and Thompson write, progress requires the ability to see promise rather than just peril in the creation of new ideas and projects, and an instinct to design systems and institutions that make building possible. While acknowledging trade-offs, they remain optimistic, arguing that we have everything we need to build the future that liberals want, clean energy and affordable housing included, today. The book's vision, though ambitious, faces challenges in navigating the Democratic coalition's competing interests and the broader political landscape. Yet it offers a compelling framework for rethinking how America can achieve a more abundant future.